Hello, I'm Tatiana Antonelli, and welcome to Forward Talks by Gumbuk, a podcast about moving towards sustainability in our region and beyond. On today's episode, we're digging into the National Pavilion of the UAE for the Biennale Arquitectura 2021 Wetland, which is curated by Wahel Alawar and Kenichi Teramoto. The prototype is created from recycled industrial waste brine, hand-cast into organic shapes to recall the UAE's traditional coral-built houses and spans 7 meters by 5 meters, with a height of 2.7 meters. The exhibit was just awarded the Golden Lion Award for Best National Participation at the Venice Architecture Biennale. To find out more about how this came to be, we're joined on the episode by Leila Brinbeck, who has served as the National Pavilion's Coordinating Director since 2014, and Wahel Alawar, founding partner at YY Design, and one of the curators of the current edition of the pavilion. Congratulations on being appointed the curators of the UAE National Pavilion at the current architecture exhibition of the Venice Biennale. How does it feel and how is the project progressing?
It feels good. I'm also proud that because this year is the 10th participation of the UAE in the Venice Biennale, not only architecture, but at the Venice Biennale. And at the same time, it's the UAE Jubilee, 50th anniversary. So it is a special moment in time in the UAE. And, it's great to be representing UAE architecture scene in this moment in time.
So it's very interesting that we're looking at the UAE as, a key figure in architecture at the moment. We all know that Dubai and the whole country has been growing, developing tremendously. And it's really interesting also to look at the sustainability aspect of this growth. And the country now is really putting a lot of effort to become more sustainable, look into new solutions, technologies, nature-based specifically. So here, I think your project is also very, very important because it looks at a nature-based solution, but also trying to solve a big challenge that is I would say very specific to the region, to the countries around the Gulf, that where we desalinize a lot, but at the same time we have specific environmental conditions where we find a lot of salt around the country. So the issue of brine is definitely a big challenge. It has been a compelling issue for some time, and even the United Nations announced a competition to inspire designers to come up with ways to repurpose this brine or utilize it constructively. So how did you first become interested in this issue and come to know about the Sabkha flats?
When I moved to the UAE, one of the hobbies to do in the UAE was diving. So I started diving. And then during my diving trips, I started looking at the corals, and over the years, 2-3 years later, I started seeing the corals turning white and many of the corals dying. And then I was informed that this is a result of bleaching, which is resulting from the excessive brine in the sea. And then brine for the first time entered into my world. Then, when the opportunity came to submit a proposal for the Biennale, for the National Pavilion of the UAE, as an architect practicing in the UAE, you always wonder, what is a sustainable material to use in this context, the UAE itself. Other countries have their vernacular sources of material to produce architecture, such as in Lebanon, you have stone. In Japan, you have wood. We can later talk a lot more about cement and the problems of cement, but it's the second most consumed material on the planet. We consume 30 trillion tons of cement today yearly. And by 2060, it is projected we will consume 60 trillion tons of cement. So the numbers are just insane. They don't add up. Cement itself contributes to 8% of global CO2 emission. The vernacular architecture of the UAE, you could say, they built traditional houses from corals that they took from the sea. But again, that was a very small population. You could do that without really harming the sea, because then they could reproduce. But today, when the population of the UAE is at 10 million, that is no longer a viable option. And then using Arish to build with, I think that is also a very nostalgic way of thinking, because we live in a modern world and we need the comforts of today, the modern world. And when we started trying to understand, okay, what is the geography, what is the geology of the UAE that could offer that vernacular, we stumbled upon the sabkhas of the UAE. And the sabkhas were fascinating landscapes, natural phenomena, that the crystal crust on the top was really a very hard cementitious material that struck us from the very beginning. It really struck us. And with little research, soon after, we discovered that actually sabkhas were used as vernacular architecture in many similar environments, and one of which is, for example, Siwa, which is in Egypt on the border of Libya, as well as, for example, Shatt al-Jirid in Tunisia. So we started investigating and looking at sabkhas in more detail, trying to understand like what is causing this cementitious effect within a sabkha. And then we quickly learned that the binding agent within the sabkha is magnesium oxide, which is MgO, and that is what binds the salts together or creates this glue. But of course, we cannot promote the extraction of sabkhas. Sabkhas are fascinating environments. They absorb CO2. Actually, I believe they are the lungs of the UAE. We don't have the rainforests, but actually 1 square meter of sabkha can absorb more CO2 than 1 square meter of rainforest. So we have these magnificent natural environments that can, that offer us that purify our environment. So we cannot go and promote their extraction in order to build or produce architecture. But at least we learned what the binding agent is from there, and then try to work with partners. And one of our biggest partner is Amber Lab at NYU Abu Dhabi, which is the Advanced Material Building Research Laboratory, trying to find a cement alternative that is inspired from sabkhas.
It's actually fascinating to hear the story and how it all came together. And this is, I think, what is really interesting. And you mentioned a couple of things that I think are fundamental for us to think about the future is how much are we going to grow? And I think at the same time, when we look at the UAE and we say, yeah, maybe we're going to reach, 20 million, which is one of the targets that the UAE has for the next 20 years. When we think about how we're going to feed this population, or how are we going to provide water to this population, and we've been desalinating already a lot. The salinity has gone up tremendously, and there is a scenario where we might not be able to desalinize anymore the water in the Gulf. So the fact that at the same time in architecture, we're looking at materials that are needed in bigger quantities to develop these new cities, it could be interesting to see, an analogy or a parallelism between the usage of this extra salt or all this brine. And this is how now that leads to my next question. How this product compare to other concretes in terms of strength and longevity, price and sustainability? I mean, I'm sure this is an early stage, but is this something that you can see already yourself with your firm utilizing on a large scale, not anymore as an experiment?
Yes, absolutely. I think we can definitely see this as a viable solution. I mean, we went to Venice with a concrete proposal on the table. Concrete in two here meanings. Let's start with understanding the problem of concrete and what we are proposing and how it is different from concrete or cement. Concrete. The problem of concrete is actually the binder, which is CaO. which is lime. And the problem starts with the conversion of limestone to lime. And there's a chemical reaction in which there is a release of CO2. And the problem of the CO2 emission from converting limestone to lime is not only the release of CO2, is how much CO2 is released. And the problem is it is a 1-to-1 ratio, meaning that to produce 1 ton of cement, you are releasing 1 ton of CO2. And that's an insane quantity. I mean, no other material is this, to put it in layman terms, is this dumb, to say it bluntly. And 1 ton of CO2 needs 1 tree for 40 years to absorb that amount. And to build a building, to build a column, just a simple column of, say, 40 by 80 by 3 meters high, that's like 1 ton of cement. So building a building is the immense amount of cement being used, and then hence an immense amount of CO2 being released. So in our case, what we did is replace the CaO with MgO. And this is where we learned from Sabkhas that MgO could be an alternative binder. Where are we getting the MgO? We are actually extracting it from the reject brine of desalination water. How does it perform? I mean, it has very different properties from what we call ordinary Portland cement. And one of the key difference is that MgO cement, in order to gain its structural strength, it needs to absorb CO2. So this is a catch-22 scenario where this is a positive thing, where you say this material, in order to become as strong as cement, will need to absorb CO2, then you are getting a plus kind of situation. But the problem with that is that in current state, in order to carbonate the material, we can only put it in carbon chambers, meaning that we can only produce it as precast element and not as a cast in situ system. But still, that doesn't mean that we cannot build using precast elements. I mean, there are buildings and towers built today from precast concrete elements rather than a cast in situ system. It's just a different way of building that we need to adapt and look into.
Thank you. Well, you took me back to my studies in construction sciences.
Oh, you studied construction sciences. That's great.
I studied architecture, but I have to say I was not really good at construction science. So I went more for the urban planning part of architecture.
Nice.
But it's fascinating, honestly. And next time we meet, hopefully I'll ask you lots of other questions.
Sure, yes.
What are your hopes for the future of this product?
Good question.
It's not a simple one.
It's not about only this product. I think it's more about what are my hopes, about architecture material in general going forward. I think, architects have to assume a responsibility over the materials they use and their impact on climate. We can no longer say this is not my problem, and I think that was the attitude of the 20th century architect. Today, we have to, this is definitely our problem. We are custodians of the planet, and we are the people that build for our future generations and our current generation. So we have to assume responsibility over the materials we use, and we have to work with so many other disciplines, be it the scientists, like we are working with the American University of Sharjah, also biochemistry lab, as well as the NYU Abu Dhabi Advanced Material Research Lab, in order to find viable alternative solutions.
I think one of the things also that, in listening to what talk about the research and how everything that he said, but I think it's also a call on architects to look at their local resources, like reinvestigate and kind of find their own solution. So even though what Wael and Terremoto have been exploring with the desalination and the brine, it's a solution to our problem here. It might not necessarily be the solution worldwide. Let's say we're not necessarily proposing that, we should be making it here and shipping it around the world, because that kind of defeats the whole purpose of sustainability. But we should be looking also internally for some of those solutions as well. So it's a very interesting way of how they've decided to approach that question.
For sure. I think what is really important is to understand that what we do locally can have a global impact. And when we look at local solutions, we can definitely make a difference. And as you say, we cannot apply the same solution everywhere. And it's very important. I remember when I started actually studying architecture, one of the professors said that the humanistic interpretation of architecture was to make sure people would live happily, that we were supposed to build buildings and cities where people would thrive and be healthy and happy. And somehow I think this has gone lost in the way we're developing cities, or we were developing cities, due to also the economy and how the economy was developing. Now we're looking at circular economies. We're looking in a totally different way to build our cities and the way we want to live. And this, I think, it's a good way also to look at the theme of this year Biennale, where the title is "How Will We Live Together?" And so it's quite ironic somehow that for the past year or so we've been living quite apart due to lockdowns and social distancing. And if we look at how we now live in general, we're growing more and more apart, less communal areas, more apartment block living. Somehow we don't even know our neighbors. And ironically, the pandemic has more than ever revealed to us that we thrive on social interactions and need communities for many different reasons. And also, I think the way we look at how we're going to build the future cities is very important. Not only the urban development and the design, but also the materials. Because if we look at architecture and building, the building sector and industry, so many times materials also were completely wrong and damaging our health. So this leads to my next question. How do you think we will live together, mainly in the UAE and the region, because I think this is one of the aspects we're all really interested in, but also globally?
When the Biennale theme came out, obviously there was no pandemic, but you're right, Tatiana, as soon as the pandemic hit, that question just took on a slightly different nuance. And I think one of the interesting things that we could see, especially here in the UAE, is how despite we were all very isolated, but we, through arts, culture, these kind of initiatives still were able to bring us together at the same time, even though we were quite isolated. So one, it's, these kind of endeavors like the Biennale, or, these more creative ways of trying to find solutions to these larger global problems are important. And I think the question of how will we live together, is a question that's going to take a little bit of time to answer. And we'll leave it, there are many different ways that you can answer it. And for this Biennale, we're looking at it through our built environment. As you said, there are a lot of concrete towers everywhere being built, and maybe that's not the solution going forward, or the materials that we're using to build are maybe need to be reevaluated. And at the National Pavilion, we try to take elements of those questions and encourage our curators to try and answer them.
When we proposed and presented this research project, also the pandemic had not been there. But yet, in my presentation, I remember very well saying that as humans, we have never been so disconnected from Earth or from our planet. And then when the pandemic hit, it just, really highlighted all of these issues that were already there, but I believe a lot were trying to disregard or undermine and not place any value towards them.
One of the key things that in being forced to slow down and reevaluate, as Wael said, your priorities, your values over the last year and a half, is that you can't do it alone. You need to collectively come together to find solutions. And I think what they've done in this pavilion for the research, it's not just Wael and Terremoto sitting, in their office figuring out this solution. They had a very collaborative methodology of research and investigation, where they brought in different universities, they brought in different experts, they discussed, and through that they came up with a particular solution that they then presented at the Biennale. And the Biennale itself is supposed to be about this international dialogue where you come together and you discuss these things, you discuss these issues. Now, normally in a regular year, you don't actually really have time to sit and discuss. But I think, I don't know if you'd call it a silver lining, but being forced to slow down meant that a lot of the curators of the different national pavilions were actually able to come together over Zoom or different methods to actually share their own personal research ideas or stories. And they together formed a curators collective, which now is, taking that idea of what the Biennale is supposed to be about, bringing us together in dialogue to answer these larger global questions, but they're really actually sitting together for the first time and actually really talking about it. And, the answer to your question, Tatiana, how will we live together? Well, individually, we can't answer that. But I think if we reach out a little bit more and realize the power of collaboration, we will find solutions and ways forward.
So to both of you, from your different, areas of expertise and different stakeholders, can you see a change in the public, not only in the aware people or the aware institutions, but in the general public? Do you see a change?
I think change happens slower than we would like it to. But it does happen. And I think every year, one of the things that we try to do to ensure that there's some kind of dialogue or that the research is still out there is that we produce a publication to accompany every exhibition, so that the questions or the investigations that are happening are in a format that can still be accessible way beyond the fact of the physical exhibition itself. And the only way that you can is awareness. We need to get out there and share what, for example, for this pavilion in particular, share what Wael and Terremoto have done, make sure they get onto the right platforms and talk about it. And then, hopefully in small ways, hope that the right kind of institutions, you have to get government involved if you want larger change. And it's a two-way street. So you need the grassroots, you need the communities to start thinking about it and spreading the word, having more talks, workshops, whatever it might be. But you also need government to get involved too, in terms of policy making and encouraging the communities and populations to make change, let's say. And those things, sometimes as much as you might want them to happen, take time. So we're always still continuing to push these things forward. And I have to say that I know that this pavilion has definitely caught the eye of government. So hopefully, or individuals within government, they think it's really interesting. So hopefully we can see this continue further, or this dialogue to continue.
I think also we are quite lucky in the UAE to see very quick action taken by the government when something needs to be done.
Yes.
If you think about it, 15 years ago, there was no idea of implementing renewable energies to be installed in buildings and have a grid where to connect. So many things have changed very, very quickly compared to, let's say, Italy, where I'm from, and things take 2000 years to happen. So definitely, we are in a privileged position in the UAE, and hopefully this work is definitely going to inspire legislation and policy, as you said, to make things happen. Wael, what do you think? Specifically, with your firm, do you see clients coming to you asking for a nature-based solution, or climate adaptation being embedded in buildings?
Yes, definitely. I mean, we are a multidisciplinary office, not by coincidence. It is by belief, because I believe that architecture, landscape, and sustainability are not three different disciplines, but they are one discipline. In the past, if you look back in history, there wasn't someone that was called so clearly identified as the architect himself. And one of the greatest exhibitions ever done about architecture, and what that was accompanied by a book, Architecture Without Architects, where communities built architecture, and they built amazing housing, or also community spaces, not only their habitable space but their social space, that are based on sustainable solutions. The materials they used were from their environment, and they learned how to build a wind tower, for example, to catch the wind and ventilate these courtyards. It wasn't an architect who came up with this genius idea. It was a community that came up with this idea. So I believe, that architecture can only be produced. Proper architecture is by collapsing all the disciplines together, and not saying, not producing a box and then say, oh, I'll put landscaping around it. This is not how it works. I believe they can only coexist and overlap. And this is how I see good architecture. So the clients come to us with a similar vision, and people are aware. I think absolutely they are aware, and with COVID they've become more and more aware. How many people today during lockdown were saying, oh, I wish my window opened. It was like they live in glass towers. It's not my case. I was probably very selective of what my house space was like. But, because there was so much emphasis on the office space, and everyone spent their time in the office. So, even all these big corporations would give you all these beautiful gimmicks in the office to play and spend time, etc., to attract you to be there. Then you really neglected your home or your house, and it just became a place where you go to sleep, and not really a place that is home, or where you can also live. So in that sense, the people selected homes based on different value system. But then when COVID hit, they got stuck at home and say, oh, I wish I had a balcony. I wish my window open, I could get some fresh air. I wish I had this small garden. And today, when people go looking for homes, they have these things in mind. They no longer can accept developments offered on the market by developers, where I believe they are inhabitable environments. Inhabitable environments. You cannot have a house where you don't get any natural or fresh ventilation, and only live off air conditioning and mechanical ventilation. It's not healthy. I don't believe this is a healthy place to live. When people say, I can no longer accept to live in this, then the market has to offer a good alternative. And as you rightly also mentioned with Leila, and you mentioned, you need government also to step in and set certain guidelines to, let's say, housing.
Well, now, because you both are, very aware and into the sustainable way of living, which, by the way, centuries ago was not being sustainable, was, the normal way of living that we completely changed. But the way you live, what is something that you do every day that you would recommend everyone to do, just to start, on our own, making a change and in the right direction?
Stop buying water bottles.
Very good. I agree.
I installed a water filter in it, so like to have drinking water in my apartment. So I don't, and I carry around water bottles with me everywhere. I mean, so if we can at least try to cut that out, that would be great. I also shopping, like when I do grocery shopping, I just buy what I need for the next couple of days. Most, I mean, again, I don't have family, I don't have kids, so maybe it's different, but you know, sometimes you do find there's a lot of excess, and especially when I go to other families' houses and the food and like all of the waste that comes with all of that as well is something to kind of consider. And tote bags instead of plastic shopping grocery bags. Get rid of the plastic. Just, you know, little things that can help.
Great. So you gave us 3 tips. Now, Wahel, are you up to the challenge?
I totally agree with Leila about these, especially these ridiculous small bottles that have how much 100 200 ml of water. I mean, these should be illegal, I think, you know, ASAP. If anyone's hearing me out there that can, you know, implement a change, these should be illegal. Absolutely. I think what is important is that we should, as individuals, stop to think of the I, you know, and the I, me or I. That's a problem, I think. And we should think of the we. It's about the collective, and what I do will impact others.
The 17th International Architecture Exhibition, Biennale Arquitectura 2021, started on the 22nd of May and will end on the 21st of November 2021, with national anti-COVID-19 measures in place. You can find more information, including links to a virtual tour, in the show notes. Thank you for listening to Forward Talks by Goombuk. I'm Tatiana Antonelli, and this episode was produced by Shira Disay. You can find our previous episodes in podcast players or at goombuk.com/podcast. And you can connect with us on Instagram at Goombuk. That's GOUMBOOK. Thank you, and see you again soon.